If you're like me, a member of the Senate in the hallways this week, I think the two questions that have come up over and over again were about the NATO meeting that just transpired over the last couple of days and the upcoming meeting on Monday between Vladimir Putin and President Trump. And I had intended to come to the floor and speak about policy towards China on trade. There's a lot to cover. There was an article this morning in the Associated Press about how the Chinese government has turned the American business class into lobbyists. They're basically telling these guys that are doing business in China, you should go back to Washington and lobby your government to stop imposing tariffs on us, or you guys are going to pay a price. But I'll have time to talk about that next week. That was really my intent. I want to focus in on this meeting on Monday between President Trump and Vladimir Putin, because there's a lot of hyperbole. I had somebody come up to me today and ask, are you concerned that the president's going to meet one-on-one with Vladimir Putin, nobody else in the room? And I said, well, first of all, I can guarantee you someone else will be in the room because Putin doesn't speak English well, and I don't believe President Trump speaks Russian. So it's not going to be a very productive meeting if there aren't at least one or two other people there. But the other is, that's the least of the things that we should be focused on. We should take this stuff serious because it's an important and serious meeting. And I don't take a backseat to anyone in terms of being clear-eyed about Vladimir Putin. And I want to talk about that today a little bit, but I want to start out by saying that let's all take a deep breath and be reasonable here. It is not unusual for the President of the United States to meet with the President of Russia because of the 16,000 nuclear weapons on this planet, 90% of them are possessed by one of these two countries, almost equally divided. So I think because this is the reason why other presidents have met with Putin or whoever the leader is of the Russian Federation, and that's why those meetings are important and will continue. That said, it is important when we analyze these meetings and what we hope they're about and what we hope they produce to understand not just who you're meeting with and what they do, but to understand why they're doing it. If you do not understand what the other side wants and what motivates them, then the meetings are not nearly as productive, and neither is our analysis or the suggestions that we make about our policy towards that country. First, it's understanding Vladimir Putin. Never met the man. I don't think you need to believe a couple things about him. The first is that he's a very suspicious human being himself, suspicious of others. And I think his KGB background probably influenced that. He also grew up in the Cold War, in Russia, in the Soviet Union, when Russians didn't even trust each other. So imagine growing up in a society where people spy on each other and you don't know if your friend in school, if you say something, could report you to the authorities, not to mention the authorities themselves looking at you all the time, and then actually being a product of their intelligence services. And so I think when you grow up in that era, in a place like that, you are naturally going to be suspicious of other people, and you're going to ascribe to them attributes. And so that is the first thing. And by the way, I think that also informs his view of the United States. It is impossible, I believe, for someone like this to grow up in that era, in that place, working where he did, and not have deep suspicions and views, negative views about the United States and the West at large. The second thing that's pretty apparent just by watching him is that this is a guy that is pretty competitive. He kind of views everything as a personal thing. Personal level dominance is important to him, but more importantly, his relationship with the United States is a competitive one. I think, by and large, he views the world as a zero-sum game, but he most certainly views the relationship between the United States and Russia as a zero-sum game, meaning that in any sort of interaction that we're having with Vladimir Putin, there is no scenario in which he envisions that we both do well. He believes that there's only so much success in the world, and the more I have of it, the less he has of it. And I do believe it informs all the decisions that he makes. There can only be one winner. I think he's also deeply driven, by the way, by his personal image. I would tell you he probably wouldn't last 2 weeks in American politics where people are habitually mocked in politics. You run for public office, you're a public figure, whether it's social media or the like. I mean, everyone gets ridiculed, mocked, and attacked. I'm not sure he could ever really put up with that sort of scrutiny. He's probably very sensitive about it. But the one thing you can tell just watching him is this is a person who works very hard to control his emotions. He never wants to look angry, or he never wants to look like he's afraid of something or worried about anything. He never wants to look like he's in doubt about anything. So he's very image-driven, and I think that drives a lot about how he controls his emotions. But the other thing that I think is common sense is if you grew up as a spy in the KGB, you know how valuable personal information is and how personal information about you can be weaponized. And so that's why we know very little about him as a person or his personal life, his health, any of these things. You would never know about it other than what he allows us to see, him on a horse without a shirt on or whatever he wants to show us that day, because he wants to control the personal information that's available, but he also wants to be able to portray this image. And the image he wants to portray is twofold. Number one, he wants an image that Vladimir Putin is an important world leader, an indispensable world leader. He's a guy that matters. And that in every major crisis on this planet, he's a person whose opinion, whose views, and whose position has to be taken into account. And that drives a lot of the decisions that he makes. It's the reason right now why they're in Libya. It's the reason right now why they're in Afghanistan. It's the reason why he's trying to figure out how he can finagle his way into the talks with North Korea. Because he wants to be an indispensable world leader, and there should not be any major discussion on the planet that he is not in the middle of. And so oftentimes he injects himself in these things for that reason. That is tied to his second aim and goal. And that is the one that drives most of what he does. And that is he wants to restore Russia as a great world power equal to the United States of America. Now, he cannot do that economically. The Russian economy is a GDP of $2 trillion, which makes it roughly the size of some of our states in the United States, but also roughly the size of Italy and Spain and other countries. So he is not an economic superpower. Therefore, he can only be an asymmetrical superpower, meaning using things that are not traditional, like cyber warfare and his role in the Security Council. And the other is military, the ability to project power and to threaten with the nuclear weapons, and also with their conventional capabilities to invade neighboring countries or to intervene in places like Syria. But ultimately, what drives him most of all, in addition to being himself personally an indispensable leader, is he wants Russia and the United States to be viewed as equal powers on the world stage, as equal powers. And I think it's pretty clear from what he has said publicly that he views the 1990s as an era of humiliation for Russia. He looks at the end of the Cold War up until the time he took over, and then just in the last few years, and he sees that Russia was weak and America was strong, and we were preying on a weak Russia, because, by the way, that's how he probably views the world. He views the world as a zero-sum game, a place where the weak are preyed on by the strong, and therefore they must be strong and they must be seen as equal to us. And understanding all of that in any interaction with them is critical to having a positive or productive, at a minimum, not damaging interaction. Because if we go in with any illusions that this is somehow somebody that if we just get along with him better, or we work on some things together, that he's going to change his behavior and be less problematic, is a fool's errand. Because at the end of the day, if you believe the world is a zero-sum game, and if you believe that the competition between the United States and Russia is one in which every time we win, they lose, and vice versa, then it's going to be very hard to find areas of interest that we could truly work on for the benefit, the mutual benefit of both countries. That does not mean that you are unnecessarily antagonistic. The bottom line is that the United States is both economically, militarily, and diplomatically superior to the Russian Federation's government in terms of our influence and our ability to do things in the world. And when you are stronger, not in image but necessarily, but in reality, it should give you a level of security to be able to figure out ways in which we can work on things that are good for our country, but also not lose the wisdom of understanding that you can often fall into traps. And that's what we do not want to fall into the trap of. So, and by the way, on this whole point of strong versus weak, I know a number of my colleagues had the opportunity to travel to Moscow during the last recess. And it's interesting, how it was covered in the American media, or how they portray the visit, how Russian media portrayed it. And I know many of them are frustrated by this. The Russian media basically portrayed them, again, it's state-controlled media, okay? So they're going to portray it any way they want. But they almost made it look like these weaklings from America came over, and, and they're very frustrated by this. But it just tells you, it gives you insight into the way they view things in the world. And that's why very rarely will you ever see an interaction that they couch as a meeting that is respectful. It always wants to put Putin in a dominant position, and it always wants to put Russia in a dominant position. And one of the tactics that Putin uses, by the way, to accomplish this is, before meetings even happen, he announces ahead of time that a deal's been struck, almost like to trap you into the deal. And obviously, since he's announcing the deal, it sounds like it's something that he came up with. All these are interesting points, but where does that lead us into these conversations? Well, there's a few things that I think we need to keep in mind. The first is invitations to work together. And they will probably happen, and he would probably pre-announce them before this visit. One, he'll say, why don't we work together on counterterrorism? And a lot of people would say, well, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, they don't like the terrorists, we don't like the terrorists. Why can't we work with Putin to go after terrorists? And ideally, the answer would be, yes, we have strong disagreements about a lot of things, but if there's an ISIS element or an al-qaeda element and we have a chance to work together on it, then we should pursue it. There's a problem, though, and this is what I hope everyone is clear-eyed about. They're not very good counterterrorism partners. To begin with, their capabilities are just not very good. We've seen that in Syria. They're not targeting terrorists. They are bombing schools and hospitals, and they've not only have they committed war crimes, they've assisted Assad in committing war crimes. If you were going after terrorists, you would go after the places the terrorists are. They've largely, for much of that conflict, spent their time going after non-terrorist rebels, or at least non-al-qaeda, non-ISIS rebels, going after those elements instead. So they're not very good at counterterrorism. They're not very capable. But the other is they use that as an opportunity to spy on us. Because when you are cooperating together militarily, you are embedded alongside each other and sharing information. That gives you a lot of opportunity to spy on the people you're working with. And so we need to be wary of that. So any effort to work together on counterterrorism has to be real, it has to be truly about terrorists, and it has to protect the United States and our information. The second thing they love to talk about is, well, why don't we work together on arms control? Well, there's two problems with arms control. It sounds good on paper. The first is they cheat, they violate it. They deny it, but they violate it. And the other is they're for arms control so long as the arms that are being controlled are the ones that we have more of, or so long as the arms that are being controlled are the ones that we are technologically superior in. They seek to use that as an advantage. And it's difficult, right? Because if you go out and you talk to people, hey, the Russians want to work together on arms control, everybody says, well, that's a great idea. I understand, it sounds very good on paper. But the reality of arms control is something very different. It means we are going to look for opportunities to cheat on our end. We are going to try to strictly enforce it on your end. Remember, zero-sum game. If they enter into a counterterrorism relationship with us, it will be one in which they win and we lose, because Vladimir Putin does not foresee a cooperative agreement with anyone, especially the country he is in direct competition with. If it's an arms reduction agreement, remember, zero-sum game, because he is motivated by the desire to win at our expense, and he would use arms control as an opportunity to do that if he can structure it appropriately. The other one we hear him talk about is cyber, and people chuckle at that. Now imagine a cyber deal with the Russian Federation under Vladimir Putin. But again, Vladimir Putin knows that the United States private sector and government has superior cyber capabilities than he does. And so if he could come up with some sort of cyber agreement that creates rules that take away our advantage, but allows them to continue to cheat and deny that they're cheating, zero-sum game. He is able to jump on top of us. So these are things that we want to keep an eye on. The other things to keep an eye on moving forward in this relationship is the unexpected. One of the things that you have seen in his behavior and his zero-sum game sort of analysis of our relationship with them is anytime he sees an opportunity to do something because we're distracted or because the world may not act, he takes advantage of it. In 2007 in Georgia, in 2013-14 in Ukraine, we could see the Ukrainian hostilities resume. The world is focused on North Korea, we're focused on the arguments with the NATO stuff, we're focused on the trade situation with China and Canada and Mexico and everybody else. Everybody's talking about something different. Ukraine has fallen off the headlines. You could wake up one morning and all of a sudden realize that hostilities have resumed, or maybe it will be a massive cyber attack. Maybe it would be ramping up their involvement in places like Libya or Afghanistan. And one morning we wake up and we realize they have deployed significant military assets to one of those two countries, or both, for that matter. And it would be very reminiscent of what we saw him do in Syria when he saw and the excuse would be, we have, the Russians were already there, we're working with these governments, they've invited us to come in and bring more people to help them, but you have to foresee that. The one thing I think we should anticipate Putin will push very strongly on is to get the United States to completely pull out of Syria. And what he ideally probably wants is some sort of quote-unquote international process to resolve it, but an international process in which Russia not only is a key player, but they get to stay in Syria. They get to keep their naval base. They get to keep their air assets. They get to keep a unified government in Syria that's friendly to them, all supervised by the international community. But the United States has to leave first. And he would love nothing more than an opportunity to set up that sort of scenario, because in a zero-sum game situation, he foresees a world in the next 5 years in which Russia has significant military and other assets in Syria permanently, potentially in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Libya. And all of a sudden, the countries of the Middle East are saying to themselves, you know, Russia and Vladimir Putin is a guy who can be a good interlocutor, a mediator of the disputes in this region. This is a person that we should be working with. This is the person who actually is more reliable to work with in the Middle East. He would love nothing more than that. And he would be able to do it without committing 100,000 troops or 50,000 troops or large loss of Russian personnel. Zero-sum game. Great power politics. The notion that he wants to be equal to the United States. Imagine if he could create a scenario in which, if he hasn't done so already, in which Russia in the Middle East under Vladimir Putin is at least as important, if not potentially more important, than the United States. A situation in which they have permanent military assets and a friendly regime in Syria, potentially in Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, and other places, and the United States is pulling out of Syria, being forced to reduce its presence in Iraq and in other places. They become de facto more important than we do in the Middle East. And he takes one step towards achieving the goal of reaching parity with the United States of America as far as an influential global power. By the way, these efforts to increase their influence would not just be limited to the Middle East. You could foresee them doing this in the Western Hemisphere. Read an article a few days ago, that big fanfare, they opened up this, what they call counter-drug school in Nicaragua. And I can only tell you that while it may very well be called the counter-drug school, when any time that a country welcomes in a limited number of Russian military personnel and others, you're welcoming in spies and influence agents and the ability to project power. They've long wanted permanent, or at least semi-permanent, basing opportunities in the Western Hemisphere, like they had during the Cold War. They already have intelligence facilities. They already have a presence in Cuba. They would love nothing more to get into a place or expand their presence in a place like Nicaragua, even potentially Venezuela for that matter. And so we need to keep an eye on all these things. This is an important conversation, but it oftentimes gets lost in all this rhetoric that is going on around the elections in American politics. We have to understand very clearly that we're not dealing with Belgium here. We're dealing with Vladimir Putin, who views the world as a zero-sum game, the strong versus the weak, and that is trying to position Russia and himself as the strong versus others who he hopes he can weaken. And he also wants, there is no interaction between us and them in which he does not want to come out ahead. He does not feel that there is such a thing as a mutually good deal. It's the only good deals for him are deals in which they win and whoever he's dealing with loses, especially if it's the United States. I would wrap up by saying that with all this in mind, I would not diminish the threat that Russia continues to pose to our electoral system, our society, and our politics. The number one objective of Russian efforts in 2016, and it would be the number one objective moving forward, is encouraging infighting in our politics. They have a clear understanding of American politics and its nuances, our societal divisions, the things we like to fight over, and how we fight over them, and where we fight over them on. And they have figured out and have gotten even better at being able to drive those narratives. And so when people ask what was the real goal of his efforts in 2016, beyond anything else, it was not electing one person or another. His number one objective was to leave a country in the United States deeply divided, at each other's throat, constantly fighting, and no matter who won that election, that is the result that he wanted, and that's the result we were going to get. Those efforts continue. The second effort I think that they have as a priority, by the way, is to create pro-Russia constituencies in the United States. And what I mean by that are people in American politics who actually take the Russian side or the Putin side of a debate. And you already see the sort of the early phases of that in some places. Now it's still a minority thought process, but it's not unusual in many cases these days because it's gotten wrapped up in all the other things that are going on. It is not outside the realm of the possible that you could see the growth of some pro-Putin element. Maybe not like what you see in Europe or in Russian-speaking parts of Europe, but some pro-Russian type constituencies in the United States whether that is somehow wrapped up around partisanship or the like. These remain their goals because among everything, remember what I told you earlier, they cannot compete with us economically. But if they can divide us from within, it weakens us, at least in his mind. And it's one of the things he can point to and say, look how weak America is. All they do is fight with each other. Their democracy is a fraud. And look how strong we are, because there's no dissent, there's no infighting going on in my Russia. Obviously, what he doesn't tell you is that whoever fights against them winds up dead or in jail, and that there's no press by which you could fight with them anyway. So these are the things to keep in mind as we move forward, because the tools that remain at his disposal are still very significant. For example, I could foresee the time or day where a lot of times there's a lot of focus in America about what could they go into the ballot box and change the votes. That's probably much harder to do because of the way we conduct elections in this country, so decentralized. Here's what a cyber actor could do. They could change party registrations. They can go into the database and suddenly, erase a bunch of voters. And imagine if they did so by being able to use analytic tools to identify, here's the people in this county that we think are likely to vote for this candidate or that candidate. And we're going to knock out a bunch of them so that on election day, a bunch of people who support a certain candidate go vote and are told you're not registered. If you get enough people to do that, and enough of those people complain to the press, you're going to have stories saying, guess what? Supporters of candidate X or Y were not allowed to vote in the election. Fraud. Democracy is dead. And you could foresee that at some point in the future. It's a real threat. You could foresee Vladimir Putin taking the next step and doing here what he's done in parts of Europe, and that's creating an enemies list. Politicians that he believes are anti-Russia, and targeting those individuals, targeting them with information he steals by hacking their emails, disclosing documents, even doctoring fake documents. Perhaps doing something like deep fakes, which is something we'll be talking a lot about next week. And that basically is off-the-shelf technology you can buy right now, where you can produce a video that, without the proper technology, you could not tell is fake, where a person is saying something they never said or doing something they didn't do, a doctored video that looks real. Imagine that. On the eve of an election, a video pops up online, the media starts to report it, of a candidate saying something offensive they never said, or taking a bribe because of a doctored video that looks real, and unless you're a technical expert, you can't tell. It's called a deep fake. They're not that hard to make. And if they're not that hard to make for someone with off-the-shelf technology, imagine for a nation state that decides to use it. You could foresee them targeting specific races. They have, as I said, a pretty good understanding of American politics. You could foresee where they would say there's a congressional race or a governor's race or a Senate race somewhere in the country that's going to be a really big deal. It has an outsized influence on American politics. And what we're going to do is that's the race we're going to interfere in. And we're going to do something to impact the outcome of it because we think that will further our narrative one way or the other. We have to be clear-eyed about all these things as we go into this. I would say perhaps the greatest goal that Vladimir Putin would have in the short term is weakening NATO. And it's not just limiting its expansion, but weakening its resolve. NATO, at the end of the day, beyond the military hardware that is a part of it, is no better than the true commitment of the nations who are a member of it to live up to its Article 5, the organizing documents commitments that we make to one another. Meaning, we have a commitment, along with our partners in NATO, that if one of us is attacked, we've all been attacked. That's only been invoked one time in its history, and that was after September 11th, 2001. But if he somehow could not just keep us from expanding NATO, but begin to undermine it from within, it would be an enormous victory because, again, for him, it would be a sign that America is diminishing, that the threats against him are diminishing, and his influence and Russia's role in the world has increased. So this is an important meeting. Probably won't be the last time they meet, but more important than the meeting are the issues at play between a leader in Russia who views everything as a zero-sum game in which either he wins or America wins, but it can't be mutually beneficial. We have to deal with him. He possesses a significant percentage of the world's nuclear weapons between the U.S. and Russia. We have 90% of the world's nuclear weapons between these two countries. We do have to talk to them, but we have to do so very clear-eyed. And that is that it is a complicated but important relationship, and we should clearly understand what motivates him and what motivates his decision-making and what their ultimate aims and goals are. in any conversation that we have.